my name is Jen Burgoyne. I'm the Mentor Program Manager at the Clubhouse Network. Part of my role is managing the Project Impacts grant through the Department of Justice. Some of you are very familiar with this grant. It's intended to strengthen mentoring practices so that Clubhouse youth have caring, supportive, and empowering youth-adult partnerships in their lives. The grant serves all youth at the 10 participating clubhouses, but it has a special focus on serving youth impacted by addiction and youth with an incarcerated parent. As we were writing our Department of Justice grant proposal a year and a half ago at this point, we researched how we could best support Clubhouse youth, particularly youth in these two populations. One concept we came across repeatedly was this topic of trauma-informed care. We know that traumatic experiences can impact the ways young people learn, relate, and experience the world. And we also know that adults can serve as supportive guides. They can be advocates and also bridges to additional services and resources. So we wanted to offer this training to the network so that staff can better understand trauma and we can all kind of learn and become more equipped with some approaches to better support youth and families. I'm very excited to be joined today by our guest speaker, Elizabeth Joy. A moment ago, I mentioned how we did some research while writing our grant proposal. Well, one of the resources I drew from and cited the most in that research was something Elizabeth had written. So as soon as the concept of this training kind of came about, I knew Elizabeth would be a great partner for us. Before I turn things over to Elizabeth and we really dive in, I wanted to make a few housekeeping notes. So first, as you might have heard when you logged on, Jason, our tech manager, is recording today's session. We'll upload the recording to Clubhouse Connect in the coming few days in case you'd like to share it or rewatch it. And then in the coming weeks, Elizabeth will also be repurposing parts of this recording for a new training that mentors can take. So we'll be in touch with more information as that is completed. I also wanted to give a big shout out and thank you to the Project Impacts group who met with Elizabeth and myself a few weeks ago to share kind of their questions around this topic and really help inform the content that will be presented today. I know a lot of you are on the line and we really appreciated that input. And then finally, I wanted to say that we want this workshop to be as supportive to you all as possible. I know many of us are muted to kind of limit the feedback, but please don't hesitate to chime in, unmute yourself. We might have the raise hand feature enabled or post your comments and questions in the chat. I've talked with Elizabeth and we may pause at certain points to be reactive to the responses in the chat, as well as I might chime in at certain points to share how the content kind of relates to the Clubhouse Network's unique mentoring model. So with all that, I wanted to introduce Elizabeth and share a little bit about her background. So Elizabeth is a licensed social worker and CEO of the Joy Society. Her direct service experience includes work in mentoring, child welfare, sexual violence, mental health, corrections, and alcohol and drug treatment. She's the former director of Mentor the National Mentoring Partnership's Ohio affiliate, Mentor Central Ohio. So if any of our Ohio colleagues are on the line today, Elizabeth might be your neighbor. And she continues to provide consulting services to the National Mentoring Partnership, including designing curriculum and training on trauma-informed, culturally responsive approaches to mentoring youth impacted by opioids. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Elizabeth. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I don't know if you guys can tell, but I hate bios. This is me like, okay, this is this is the awkward part where we talk about ourselves. So I'm glad we got past that. Again, so excited to be with you all. Appreciate the work that you do. And as Jennifer said, we really want this to be interactive. So I'm going to challenge you if you tend to show up trying not to interrupt or trying not to speak too much. Obviously, if you're one of those talkative people like me, we want you to be thoughtful, but please do jump in the chat or come off of mute if you have a question or have something you'd like to add. While I certainly have a lot of expertise in this work, you all are experts in your own right. So even in our conversation with the group a couple weeks ago, it was just helpful to hear from other folks. So please feel free to add your thoughts and or ask questions. Jennifer and my colleague Lane are monitoring the chat, and I am as well. Certainly if it's something really specific to the content at hand, we don't want to miss it. So again, feel free to jump in. Before we get into the serious stuff though, I do want to give you guys a moment to just let me know how you doing. So I got some visuals. There's some folks who are super committed to dogs and just absolutely can't do cats and otherwise, and the rest of us just have to find our way. So I'm going to ask you to jump in the chat and then and let us know your number, but you got to put cat or dog next to it so we know how it is you're doing to get started. This should be fun. All right, Holly's first up. Ooh, Holly. That's what I looked like yesterday before I washed his hair. Oh, who wants to jump on while folks are checking in on the chat? Somebody jump off mute and let me know. Oh, Dolores gave us dog and cat check-in. Dolores, talk to me about it. Dog 7, cat 5. Do you mind sharing?
Well, it's been a really long couple weeks.
Yeah.
And you know, there's a little dichotomy there, but I'm paying attention. I'm engaged in the meeting today, in the training, but I'm also really exhausted.
Well, I'm tired too. I don't wear that as a badge, but I am definitely tired. So I feel you on that. Thanks for checking in with me. Who else wants to jump in? Christine gave me a 1 with an exclamation point. Now, Christine, is that a dog or a cat 1? Because one of them's drinking wine.
For me, it was the dog 1. Here in Massachusetts, it's rainy. And so just, that cuddly feeling of having the blanket on and being able to participate in this workshop from home, feeling comforted.
I love it.
But I kind of went 1 with the cat too.
Yeah, right. That was me last night. I'm going to just be honest. That was me last night. Oh, my boy Xavier is on. What's up, Xavier? 7 and 8 dog. Talk to me, Xavier.
Actually, you're supposed to be 7 dog, 9 dog.
Okay.
I put 8 cat just to be goofy in my hair right now, but I'm going with 7 dog, 9 dog just because I feel like I'm using my music, and outside is kind of gloomy, but I'm feeling like I have a good vibe right now. So I'm going with 7 dog, 9 dog.
I love it. I'm gonna need you to bring that energy to help me along. We got a little bit of a plow ahead. So I appreciate your energy.
Got you.
Appreciate you. One more person. Who else wants to give just some context to their check-in?
I can go. I can explain my number 8 dog.
Okay, talk to me, Holly.
So about a week ago, my mom broke her femur, and she's 75, and she is home from the hospital now. But I am her primary caregiver right now. So I am working from home, and I am absolutely overwhelmed and exhausted.
I can feel that. I feel that. Love and light to your mom. My Nana had that happen. I just had a Facebook reminder come up about, it was a couple weeks ago when she finally got out of the hospital. My Nana turns 100 next year, and she broke her hip. I guess that would have been 2 years ago. Well, I don't know, girl, because I don't, it's COVID. We don't really know what day or time it is anymore. But anyway, I'm just remembering because I saw the video that I took of her getting out. So I know that just the scary, especially at that age of making it through. And I know how absolutely submissive or not folks at that age can be when we really want them to follow directions so they can be safe, but they don't really want to. So right. Love and light to you, Holly. You might want to tap into cat 1 at some point. Not that I'm encouraging wine for coping, but sometimes it helps. So
thank you.
I feel you, and love and light to you.
Thank you.
And love and light from Xavier as well in the chat. So yeah, no timeline for COVID. So again, thank you guys for humoring me with the check-in. Hopefully just something a little lighter helped to get us started. Obviously, We are visiting somewhat of a heavy topic. I really try to do trauma trainings a little different. Jennifer confirmed that she felt like this is different than what she's seen before. So I'm hoping that this is, if you've had trauma training before, it's not what you've heard or seen before. I'm hoping that it has much more application than probably what you're used to, and that we can find a way to have fun and not feel like we are depressed and need to drink wine afterwards. So that said, though, we are together for 2 hours and it is a heavy topic. So please take care of you, whatever that means. I love to see your faces as much as I can while I'm screen sharing. So I appreciate those of you who are on camera. Appreciate you, Maria, because you and your baby are like right here center for me, which is such a gift. So I appreciate that. So take care of yourself as you need to. If you need to, go step away for a minute. This is being recorded, so you don't have to worry about missing anything. Whatever you need to do, because we all take care of ourselves differently. Everyone who knows me will tell you, a lot of us talk self-care. I truly walk it. So to me, what is this work if we're not living our best lives as models for those that we serve? So again, please take care of yourselves, step away if you need to. I don't think I'm going that deep in content, but you never know what can trigger folks. So again, take care of yourself, secure your own mask before assisting others. All right, so why does this matter? We're focusing on culturally responsive trauma-informed mentoring today. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I think it's just important to sort of ground ourselves, right? So first of all, from the culturally responsive perspective, we know that while life is hard for a lot of folks for different reasons, folks who are unfortunately dealing with oppression and racism really deserve a responsive approach. So us being thoughtful in how we show up to folks who deal with that is obviously really important. Secondly, we're dealing with humans. We're serving humans having a human experience, and how we show up to them matters. We literally, I hope you guys know this, like we literally have the ability to change people's lives for the better or for the worse. So how we show up truly matters. Lastly, having knowledge is critical, right? But knowing that knowledge alone won't ensure that we effectively provide support is also important. And it gives us an opportunity to avoid attempting to become experts, trying to show up like an expert. In fact, when we show up admitting that we're not experts, we're really on a great path to do so. So you're going to find I don't go heavy on stats. I'm really going to go heavy on the human experience, because that's what it's all about. Plus, by now, you've probably had enough trauma trainings with a bunch of stats in it that you don't need to hear that from me. Before I jump into, I just want to say, for me personally, I am a trauma survivor. I have always done work from a trauma-informed approach. Before that term was a term, it's the only way I knew, because I knew for me what was needed as a youth when I experienced the height of my trauma. I didn't put details on here, but this is just a screenshot of my case from 1996 when I was 16 years old. The woman on your screen is Webb. She was my victim witness assistant. And I just looking at her picture could make me cry right now, because she changed my life so much. I actually just ran into her at the beauty shop about a month ago, and it was automatic waterworks, right? Because just the way she showed up to me in that moment of my life, it felt like no one else understood. And I always felt like she was there. We're going to talk about boundaries later. And if you guys could remind me, Jennifer, I didn't even think about this, but I think the way that Laura approached me is a perfect example of how we can show up with absolute care, but with boundaries. Because while I can tell you how much she impacted my life, she did it in a way that didn't become enmeshed, didn't become over-involved, and didn't cause me unintentional harm by getting too close to me. So I just share this to say I show up to this work as an expert, primarily from experience, not only as a trauma survivor, but as someone who really has worked to figure out how to be good at life after trauma. So I live this. And I appreciate what you guys do. I know how hard it is. So what we're going to do today, I'm going to do a super high level overview of trauma. Again, I'm going to give just super basics because there may be some folks who haven't had a trauma training. So I want to make sure we kind of have that foundation there. We are going to touch a little bit on some special populations and a few things to note. Then we're going to talk about trauma treatment just for a tad, just because I think it's important as a mentor when you are working with folks who are dealing with systems and treatments, that you have a little bit of context as to what actually happens there. And then we'll get into the application part for effective mentoring. So that's what we'll be up to as we push through. So moving into trauma and just understanding it and some quick notes. One of the first things that I think is always important is to know this isn't about them. Normally we say this isn't about us, this is about them, but I'm actually presenting that this isn't about them, it's about us. And why I say that is that we are trauma survivors too. More than likely, everyone on this call has had at least a very challenging life experience that really altered how you thought about yourself, how you thought about others, how you thought about the world. And so when we start seeing it as us, the learning about us, it makes it much easier to first understand the topic and the training, but most specifically understand them, the folks that we're working with and for. They are us and we are them, right? It's folks having real life experiences. And we're thinking about how do we show up in a way that can be supportive. And quite frankly, some of this you can use, all of this really, you can use for yourself, because some of us have some trauma we haven't healed. And so just thinking about how this applies to us could be helpful. Lastly, I think it's always important, I'm going to cover the potential impacts of trauma from the negative experience perspective, right? But let's be clear, having a traumatic experience in life does not mean that you are destined for subpar outcomes, right? It certainly the data shows that once you have traumatic experiences, there's other crap that can happen, right? But it doesn't mean that you're destined, right, for that. So let's just make sure when you listen to me and when you go out and do the work that we're not assuming that just because folks have had rough experiences and are maybe in the middle of some really rough stuff in their lives, that doesn't mean that you know, the future is necessarily dim. All right, so quick overview on trauma. I have on your screen how SAMHSA defines trauma. Individual trauma results from an event or series of events or circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and has lasting adverse effects on physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. The visual on your screen is from the ACE study. Let me know in the chat if you guys are familiar with the ACE study. Hopefully you are. The ACE study asked 10 questions, and each of these little images represent one of those 10 questions about the different types of trauma a child could experience in their life, and indicated, you know, that as a result, there are some negative outcomes that could happen later. On the right side of your screen, there are some things that aren't listed there as potential ideas for trauma: witnessing or experiencing violence, separation from loved one. So that's loss, abandonment, divorce, even breakup. Sometimes we don't think about breakup or divorce as traumatic, but those of us who've been through a hard breakup know that's life altering, right? Natural disasters, we look at obviously hurricanes, COVID, all of that stuff. I think we can all account for and confirm that 2020 has been traumatic, right? But two that aren't thought about is poverty and systemic oppression, which we'll talk about in a second. But what I really want you to understand is that trauma, whether it's trauma, depends on who you ask, right? So if Jennifer and I were twins, born of the same mom and dad, we might have exactly the same historical experience. Maybe we both had abuse by our dad, right? But one of us, the way we internalize that experience, would call it trauma. Like it was very disruptive in our lives. Maybe we fell into addiction, you know, just really had a hard time from there. The other of us processed it differently, right? And so while we would say it was a hard time and a hard experience, we wouldn't necessarily define it as a trauma. So it's not necessarily about the thing that happened. It's about how an individual processes it, that sort of registers as trauma. So it's important to remember that, because you could encounter someone who you find out has like what you think is the most ridiculously crazy thing ever happened to them. And so you start to assume that life must be really hard and they're just really going through and they're really struggling. But in fact, they've handled it quite well. On the flip side, you might encounter someone who in your mind has some experiences that you don't think are that major, but to them, they were life altering. So it's just important that we're not assuming what trauma means. It's really all about the individual's experience and how they process that. On the racism side, it's really important for us to also know that racism is trauma, oppression is trauma. And so I'm not going to go through this whole slide, but it just kind of speaks to a lot of the symptoms, which you're going to see show up in the following slides about how trauma can show up as far as symptoms in an individual's life. These symptoms that are at the bottom of your screen and reactions to trauma are very much similar, if not exact, to what you might see in a rape survivor or a child abuse survivor or neglect survivor. So memory loss, nightmares, depression, feeling like you want to avoid things, increased vigilance, all of those things are again, symptoms that you see in other traumas, but those specifically show up for folks who are dealing with racism. So it's important to note when we're working with minority populations that those are some additional components that we really need to be thoughtful about. The biggest note to me about trauma is that it's a hidden wound, right? So on your screen, you see this brain. On the left side is this healthy brain. And then on the right side, you see an abused brain. And you can obviously see that there's a total difference in that imagery. And I think that's the big thing to note about trauma is that you can't see it. And so different than when we talk about other disabilities or very impactful life experiences, it's hard to know what's going on with the trauma. So if I have a broken leg and I walk in the room with a cast on my leg, you're obviously going to know that something happened and I'm going through something. But with trauma, we can't see it. So it can impact us in many ways. Neurodevelopment, it can be an issue. Our cortisol levels can be impacted. And that's that stress hormone that helps us manage and deal with stress. And as a result, when those cortisol levels are impacted, we could be more likely to experience anxiety, depression, and PTSD. There was actually a study done on Holocaust survivors' grandchildren that found that even those who hadn't experienced any direct trauma in their lives, just by being the descendants of folks who had experienced trauma, were more likely to have these different symptoms and potential diagnoses later. Again, something to note when we think about racism and oppression, when you're working with populations who have a history of traumatic experience.
Hay una un historial de experiencias traumáticas.
We're getting a little bit of feedback from, I believe, one of the interpreters.
Okay.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, thank you for muting.
Okay, if there was a question, let me know. So yeah, anyway, the just understanding that these kind of realities are important when you think about minority populations and those who've been through racism and oppression and things of that nature. So that means that I could be born into an increased likelihood for these things just because my grandparents went through such a thing. Obviously, health and disease are things that can come out. The ACE study helped us to understand that. Behavior issues and the adoption of health risk behavior. So you think about coping. So we joked a little bit about drinking wine, to deal with stress, but we know that there's sort of that spectrum of when having a glass here and there or engaging in some sort of substance here or there becomes a coping mechanism. And because of that adoption of risky and health risk behaviors, that's where you start to see some of the ACE study outcomes show where we have early death, we have disease, cancer, all of those kinds of things kick in. I think we still have somebody off mute. Thank you. So again, just important to understand that we can't see it. So we really just have to be thoughtful and really tuned in relationally to have a sense of who we're dealing with and how we might need to respond, which we're going to spend a lot of time today getting into how do we respond to this stuff. So just a quick list of some of the signs, symptoms, and coping mechanisms. And these are things you can see in youth and adults. And I think that's another thing we miss, especially in the youth work world. We tend to think of trauma and trauma surviving from a youth perspective, but it's really important to note that adults were once kids who had potential trauma in their youth. And hello, we're adults and we know life is hard in adulthood, right? So it's not just something that happens in childhood, it's really life, you know? So when you have trauma, these are just some of the things that might show up, whether it's headaches and stomach aches, the way in which it might manifest physically, anger, in the sense of, you think about youth acting out in school and, you know, we're punitive, punishing that, but is it that they're misbehaving, or is it that they're struggling to express that what they're experiencing traumatically, right? Or some historical experience they haven't been able to resolve. So a lot of these behaviors, interestingly, show up as bad kid behavior, right? So that's another reason why it's so important that we think about a trauma-informed response. They also show up as bad parent behavior, right? And so that's another thing that I stress when working with folks who serve youth, is that we got to really make sure that we're showing up as passionately for the adults in our youth's lives and their parents as we are them. Because when we show up supportive of the youth, but judgmental of the parent because of their behavior or you know, whatever they have going on, we really missed it. We really missed the boat when we do that. So yeah, stomach aches, Ty, that's a good one. Again, it's just hard to know. Sometimes you think you're just tired, but it's really related to something else. You think you just have a headache, but just important to kind of keep these in mind. The last thing I want to note on this is that sometimes there's no sign at all, and or the second to the last point on their positive symptoms. I am a person who, I had trauma early in life and I had zero acting out. Like no one, everyone was completely blown away when I finally told my story after I was an adult, because I was a high performer. I was always doing well in school and this and that. And quite frankly, sometimes those are trauma responses. By performing well, by being a perfectionist, by kind of staying out of the way, being quiet. So we got to also remember not to leave out loving on and supporting the folks who aren't acting out or don't look like anything's wrong. That doesn't mean that there's not something they're going through. So just something to keep in mind. Any questions on the super quick high level overview of trauma?
Yeah, Elizabeth, I have something, a question. It was interesting right now that you said that, like, if there's positive symptoms, I have to assume that there hasn't been trauma. So how would you like deal with someone if it's positive? Wouldn't we want those behaviors to keep going, or?
Well, yeah, good question. Here's the thing. I mean, you could argue that that's better, right, than a kid who's not doing well in school. However, I can tell you again, from personal experience, at some point I had to check down, like, dude, I mean, I get a lot of kudos for all these freaking letters behind my name, but at what point is that not traumatic in and of itself for me to continue to so it's almost like I had to start realizing that I was doing it to validate myself. So it's not positive anymore if I'm performing well to continue to try to prove to myself that I'm worthy. So when you look behind that behavior, there's something that we could really maybe adjust there, right? So yes, it's great you're doing great in school, or yes, it's great that you're doing great in your career. But if doing great is tied to perfectionism and high stress and anxiety, if you don't do everything perfect, you have to have an A. Now we get to a whole nother, a different kind of stress, right? So does that make sense as to why there could be some issues with a positive symptom? Makes sense? Yeah, okay. Anybody else thoughts on that? Go ahead.
No,
Gustavo.
it makes perfect sense. Yeah, I think it could be like the behaviors that you're trying to, exactly like you said, you're trying to validate yourself or prove something that is leading you towards those behaviors. So interesting.
Yeah, and it's sad because a lot of those kids will never be in our programs, because we tend to, most programs like these attract the folks who are getting attention for the wrong reasons, right? So sadly, you know, sometimes we overlook those folks.
And so this is and I also want to say, like, sometimes that comes into codependency, where they get into the cycle of like, I need to perform well in order to be liked or in order to validate myself. And we should see that here as well.
Absolutely. Good point. Yeah. So, I mean, right now I don't do clinical work anymore. I do some executive coaching, and I work with some high-end blue chip clients like athletes and stuff like that. Right. So you're like, oh, you got it all together. You're making money and you people know you and all that. But so what I see, and this is again been the case in my life, is that my trauma has benefited me in some ways because it's motivated me to perform, but I can look back and say, sometimes I go too hard, right? Like there's ways in which some of that stuff isn't so healthy, right? So those are things later in life I've kind of adjusted. I first, of course, worked on all the funky negative stuff, but then I had to start looking at myself to say, what are some of the positive things that maybe I'm going too far with? So good stuff. Anybody else, thoughts or questions? All right, so a couple of
challenge you. 1 second. I do feel like we have those people in our spaces. I just feel like they're the young people who are like the young mature ones, when like you're 13 and you have like 7 other responsibilities, and so you show up in this space and you're good. So I do feel like we do interact with them. We just, oh, now they're good, they're mature, so yeah, we don't have to worry about them. And I feel like that's what we tend to do, but we have them in our spaces.
Okay, yeah, and it depends on what kind of program you have, because some programs literally you get referred someone because, and all you get are the people who have come to the school, the attention of the school. So if you're in a space where you're interacting with all the kids, then yes, you see them, which is really great, Xavier, because that means you have an opportunity to lean into some of those folks who are overlooked because they're doing well. So good call on that. All right, so special populations. And again, Jennifer, I think you wanted to make a note on this.
Yeah, thank you. I did want to offer a little context for this next section here. I mentioned earlier that our Department of Justice grant required that applicants address how we would serve special populations, including youth impacted by addiction and youth with an incarcerated parent. And our impact sites have done an initial survey that found that across the 10 sites, our grant is currently serving at least 40 youth affected by addiction and 27 youth with an incarcerated parent. Nearly all 10 sites were serving at least 1 youth in one of these populations. And I say all this because, you know, if you're not part of impacts, you may not know whether you're serving youth impacted by addiction or youth with an incarcerated parent. It's not something we ask in our AMP reports or our youth impact surveys, but it's very likely that you are. So we think and hope that this next section on those 2 special populations will be applicable to everyone.
Thanks, Jennifer. And as Jennifer and I were talking, kind of preparing for today, I realized what a great point that sort of sub point comes from that. And that is, we're never going to know the full story of the folks we're working with, right? So when you're not serving a particular population who is facing a particular issue, right, then you may not know that they're a trauma survivor, or you may not know that this youth's parent is currently incarcerated, or you may not know that this youth's parent is struggling with drug addiction, right? So that's all the more reason why that trauma-informed approach is critical, because we don't know what folks' experiences are. If you think about yourself, Holly or Maria or Fran, like you have your own story. No one knows your whole story. And in some cases, folks will never know, right? Those things that maybe would come up on one of my PowerPoints, right? But you know that if folks were to treat you in a way that honors some of maybe the unique challenges you have as a result of those experiences, that would be really awesome, right? So that's the whole point in the trauma-informed approach, is that we're always cognizant, whether or not we know that someone's been through said issue or life challenge, that we're showing up thoughtfully. And when we see a behavior that feels funky or feels misaligned, that rather than judge that behavior as negative or something that needs to be addressed, see it as a sign that maybe I need to go heavy on empathy right now, even if I don't have the answers as to the why. And that's the other piece too, is that we're never going to be full experts on everything to do with trauma-informed everything, because at minimum, we know every human is different, and what we need and what kind of response we need is different. So I could spend 3 million hours with you guys, and we can't be experts at every individual's reality, right? So the bottom line is just always to show up with empathy and thoughtfulness, right? So I guess that's enough on that. So for the substance misuse population, obviously the opioid epidemic really sort of brought that population to light. I did that opioid training with a national mentor a couple of years ago, and I'm doing some work with them to refresh that. And even in that work, what many people thought as who's affected by opioids is not necessarily what folks thought. You know, it's like it's all Caucasian rural people, right? Which wasn't the case then. And in the new data, not only was it not the case then, but when we look at where and what kind of drugs are being used and how this whole thing is playing out, it's totally different than it was 2 or 3 years ago when I did that research and training. So substance misuse is similar to working with minority populations in that a lot of stigma, a lot of judgment, and just a lot of misunderstanding, right? So we're not going to go into those details today, but just want to cover a couple of points to be thoughtful about. This first slide just talks about how substance misuse can impact parenting. Obviously, neglect and time and attention might be an obvious one. Overly permissive is another one where maybe the kids kind of can just do whatever they want to do because the parent's busy struggling with, you know, what they're struggling with. Enmeshment and lack of boundaries, treating their children as sort of like their friends, failure to provide the structure and discipline, potentially high stress or use during pregnancy, excessive, harsh, abusive discipline, and sometimes just the inability to provide basic needs. And really, this is kind of like, you could have like the overly permissive, hanging out, fun parent, which is really struggling with addiction. And then you could have like that really harsh situation where it's obvious that there's a problem. But there's a lot of ways in which substance misuse can affect parenting. And it's the challenge with addiction too, is that addiction is the most extreme version of misuse, but there's a whole lot of folks who are not necessarily in the category of addiction, but are struggling with misuse. And so that can be kind of hard to detect and to deal with and figure out how to respond. This slide just really speaks to sort of some of the traumatic experiences that youth who are living with a parent or an adult struggling with misuse might deal with. Obviously, abandonment physically if the parent is not around, but also emotional abandonment if they're not present, right? Not really engaging. Assuming caregiver roles for themselves or their siblings or their parent, right? So some of them are working to provide for their family or getting themselves and their siblings ready for school, helping with homework, sometimes even physically or emotionally caring for a parent. Oftentimes there's guilt and shame, just, you know, embarrassment from their parents' use or struggling to try to figure out how to hide their use. Some of them are struggling feeling responsible for that use, being talked about at school. And then this is a big one, that internal conflict. And I see this even with youth who are in foster care where their parents, something happened where they were removed. There's that conflict between the desire to kind of give help and support or feeling like you're betraying your parent by siding with the folks who are saying that their parents' behavior is problematic. Some other issues include pressure to perform or underperform. So when I did the listening tour a couple of years ago, we heard stories of parents who were challenging their youth not to do well in school so that they could qualify for certain programs or assistance. Others are trying to be perfect to kind of avoid drawing attention or to avoid the wrath of a parent if they're not behaving in a way that their parents want them to. Obviously, basic needs not being met, witnessing abuse, drug use, or other inappropriate behaviors in the home. Unfortunately, some of them have been through the actual death of a caregiver or parent, and then that constant cycle of hope and disappointment as that parent goes through change, sobriety, whether or not they're going to get quality time, and over time, just that feeling of hopelessness that can come up as a result of that. Any questions or thoughts just on that quick couple points on youth struggling or families impacted by misuse, substance misuse?
Hi, this is I couldn't find my hand raising.
Oh,
I think, but I'm just gonna talk.
Yeah, just come on, because I can't see all you guys. So even if you raise your hand, I might not see it. So just go ahead and come on. It's all good.
Okay. Well, excuse me. A lot of this is also, it's hard to tell because of, and it goes with trauma and what you said about poverty. And a lot of this can be seen in parents who are working 2 or 3 jobs, trying to make ends meet and adding that stress onto it. So I just kind of want to say that sometimes there's a correlation between two, whether or not they're using drug or not, but that poverty is also, can also exhibit these behaviors as well.
Yeah, that's a good call. And that's why I always try to bring up poverty in that trauma conversation, because I feel like people don't think about poverty when they think about trauma. But you know, if you are blessed to have never been hungry or struggled like that in your life, just knowing like if you have to go long without food, I mean, I don't know about you guys, like I can get really mean, you know, right? So I mean, and that's like a casual adult reality, and I'm completely capable of doing something about it. So you think about the stressor of constantly not having, constantly struggling. I mean, even some of us are living check to check, even if we are paying the bills, and we know that that's stressful. So I think that's one of those, and I appreciate you making that point, that we just have to really remember that struggle, you know, it's constant too. It's not like it's an incident, it's ongoing. So good point. Thanks for bringing that up.
I wanted to say something following up on what my guy just said, that in our population, something that's very common is the eldest sibling gets a lot of the responsibility for the little ones.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that would constitute maybe like is it a trauma, or is it just stress that they're going through? Because it might not be necessarily drug abuse or this kind of we're talking about, but there's definitely these symptoms, as my guy just mentioned, that they do populate. And I've seen the stress that these older siblings go through because of working parents and trying to make.
You know, it's interesting. We've gone so hard on the term trauma, and just in this past year, I am like realizing I personally am going to start abandoning the word trauma, although it's hard because when someone like Jennifer is looking for someone to do a training, then that's the word, that's the language they know. But the more I've thought about all of this, to your question, is it trauma, is that I would prefer to use the term impactful, right? It makes it easier to understand, because then you're like, is it trauma? So was it hard enough to be a trauma? But if we just say impactful experience, then there's less question, right? About, is that an impactful experience to be adultified and always be caring for yourself and your siblings? I'd say so, right? And the other thing is that sometimes you don't realize how heavy a thing is, right? And sometimes the hard thing is also combined with something good, like, so to be honored, to have the responsibility, or have your parents trust you, like, so there's the good part of that. But then it's like, and then you love your siblings, but then you like kind of wish you could play more, right? So I don't know if we would call it trauma, but we could definitely say it's impactful life experience. Is that something that could likely impact how someone interacts with life later? Yes, it could turn out to be one of those high performers, like we just talked about earlier, right? Where they are really responsible and really like on point with everything, who is also the person who doesn't know how to like balance themselves and take care of themselves, because they're always on point and always thinking about everyone else. And to someone else's point, could result in some codependency, where you always feel like you need to be looking out for someone else. So again, these are the reasons why, you know, we say the word trauma just to, I think, to help us all know what we're talking about, but we're all having life experiences. All of our youth are having life experiences that, depending on how it's internalized, is impactful, and even impactful for the good, right? So an impactful experience could be for the good, because I can say that all of even the funky stuff I've been through, I can tell you something good that I learned from it, or some way in which I was able to, you know, use that resiliently, you know, in my life later. But nonetheless, it was, you know, a hard moment. So I think this just, again, reiterates the point. We're all having life experiences and being thoughtful about how life impacts how we see ourselves, others, in the world. that's really what this comes down to kind of simplify it. Does that make sense, Gustavo, and sort of respond to your point? Cool. Anybody else? Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, this is my, I don't want to be
No, you're
a
good.
hoarder of this, but I, along with what Gus said, is like, then it goes into the level of intersectionality between culture and what the different cultural responsibility and expectations are. Because like, you know, I, for example, am Hmong and I am the oldest child. So those are my roles and responsibilities. So I wouldn't consider that as trauma, but then how would you know trauma, which then gets me into a cycle of, is trauma a Western type of like definition or experiences versus like a more Asian cultural experiences in that too. So it just, I mean, it's always interesting. Trauma work is also interesting to me, and language and all of that.
Yeah. And you know what, I at some point I probably will completely get to where I can not use it, because like I'm pretty much committed to the fact that I don't like the word anymore. I like that, because really all it comes down to, take all the extraness away, it comes down to being responsive, understanding that everyone has a life journey, right? Like we don't even have to go past that. I would also, you reminded me, I had lost my point because I was getting so into everything I was saying. On the culture tip, I think another challenge with culture and trauma is that some of the very nature of culture, especially with POCs, is that, again, that double-edged sword. So if you're in a communal culture, like your culture and mine, right? Looking out for one another, always making sure everyone's okay. Like we love that part of our culture, but there's some stuff about that can be problematic. And as POCs, like we don't want to call our peeps out and be like, yo, there's part of this that actually hasn't been good for me, right? Because, you know, your auntie was so supportive and she always, you know, so I think that's a whole conversation, right? About where is the difference between the Eurocentric components of the trauma definition that are problematic, but also where are the applications of some of this actually is an issue, and it has to do with culture and how we've always done it within certain cultures that maybe isn't so great anymore. I think about the African-American culture and the heavy commitment to church and Christianity, and then that leads to, you don't go get help, you just let the pastor pray on it, and we don't need counseling, you know. So it was great at first, and then there's this other end of the spectrum where like, whoa, hold on. But then we're like, oh, I don't want to say anything because I don't want to like disrespect my elders. So like, you know, so then you're like in this debate with being trauma informed and culture responsive and earning my family, you know. So like, clearly I'm not about solving none of them problems today, but it is a thing, right? And something to be thoughtful about. So thanks for that good combo. I love it. Anybody else want to add to that? And thank you guys so much for engaging. This is so much better when I'm not just the only one talking. All right, so I just have one quick slide on and the impact of incarceration on youth and their family. And again, none of this, let's be clear, A, I can't teach you guys everything in one day, and B, there's no one slide or 2 slides or 10 slides that would ever cover everything. So I show up with that asterisk next to everything. But here are a couple of things, and really, to your point, a lot of this stuff looks just like what we just saw on AOD impacted families or poverty impacted families. So not necessarily unique, but there are certainly some nuances. So things to think about: abandonment, actual or emotional. I think that strain of having visits when you have a parent incarcerated, A, almost always they're at least an hour away. B, you as a youth have to hope that your family will take you to see your parent or your loved one as much as you'd like to see them. The worry about the parent, guilt, anger, confusion, all of that stuff. That caregiver role is once again at play here, especially when you look at the single family home component that incarceration then causes. Feeling that shame again about having a parent who's incarcerated. Of course, the financial difficulties. A couple of things, and I happen to have extensive experience working in prisons. I've spoken at almost every prison in the state, and it's a population I really enjoy working with. But let's keep it real. The prison system is questionable at times, right? So if you've ever visited someone in prison, then it's very likely you might have encountered some really funky behavior by the people who check you in and decide whether or not you get to visit, and what you can wear and how much time you can spend. So just going in, if you've never done it, I can just tell you it's traumatic. Just being in there, like just the process, right? It's a lot, let alone if you're a kid. I've not done it as a kid. I've done it as an adult, and it's so not only as a kid do you know that your parent or loved one is in there, but you see how the staff are acting at times, and you know that same staff is with your loved one. So what's happening? Those are things that kids would have to deal with. Another big one is that cycle. If you're familiar at all with incarceration, whether it's when you first get arrested or when you're trying to get out later and you've served time, that whole thing of whether or not you're going to get your parole hearing, whether or not they're going to give you parole, whether or not when you go to court you're going to actually get a ruling that day. Like, it is such a horrible cycle, and I went through that as a child in my trauma of having to go to court, and then you stress for 2 weeks leading up to it, and you go and then nothing happens. You sat there for 4 hours, nothing happened, and then you leave, and then you wait for 30 days and you just do it over and over again. So that's one of those unique components of this population. Another one is negative attitudes that the family members might have about the incarcerated person. So if you're a kid and you love your parent who's incarcerated, your auntie might not, or your mama might not love your dad because he's left me, so you got dealing with them talking about negatively, your family talking negatively about the person who's incarcerated. And of course, as a result, there's risk for adoption of maladaptive behaviors. So those are just a couple of things to keep in mind on that population. Anybody want to add anything on that, or comments worth adding?
I wanted to add something, and I don't know if we will be grateful for COVID or not, but now with kids that have incarcerated parents, there's the option of doing video calls with them, so that avoids the 4-hour drive, 2-hour drive to see them, and the impact before and after on the family, on their emotional situation. I think that it helps a little bit with the connection between the youth and the member of the family who is incarcerated. And now it's a little odd to think that they can just call anytime, they can just video call twice a week. That helps a little bit, right? Helps a little bit with that emotional support, and with that like negative talking between like the family members, and the kids can actually see that the member, the parent, whoever is in prison, that actually cares about the kids, right? Actually is there for them whenever they need it. So another thing that I wanted to add is, how do you refer to that member, that parent, to the kids? Like, how do you, I think I asked you this before, and is what are the words we use? Like, sometimes I'm trying to talk to that kid, like that young person, about their parent who is incarcerated. They really want to talk about it and they really want to get out there, but then which words do you use, right? Like, how do you want to refer to court and the time, all that stuff? I think is very tough for me personally, to say, oh yeah, your dad is in jail and you this, like, it's too rough. Like, it's too rough for a young person to just hear those words. But I don't know other words to actually talk about it,
Yeah, I think one suggestion, because you could really ask that question for any scenario or any person or family you're dealing with, of like, what are the right words? I always start with what are the words they use, and that gives me an idea of what words I might use. And sometimes, and this is a big one, like sometimes we get so worried about how to do this or what to say and not say. Sometimes we just need to ask. right? How would you like for me to refer, or what words would you like to use? You know, depending on the situation, sometimes we just need to ask. And then again, take the lead from what words and language they're using. I think also sometimes while we're very thoughtful, and I think it's awesome, sometimes we also underestimate just how resilient our kids are, and that they can handle more than we think they can. But always following their lead, no matter who I'm working with, even with you guys, and Jennifer can tell you, I'm listening and I'm sensing, and I'm responding even in this moment to decide how heavy I go on one point versus another, because I'm in tune with you and I'm catching your vibe. So when we just show up to every relationship like that, that's a more simple answer, because there's no one answer, right, Maria, to your question. But when we catch vibe and we're really just sensing who's in front of us and what's happening in the moment, then that gives us some clue as to what and when and what words. I know it's not an exact answer, Maria, but it's the best one I got for you right now. Anybody else want to add something on that?
Yeah, this is James Carter here calling from Memphis. I love to tap in and just to piggyback off what you were saying. And even see, I've had some experience working with special ed in this day treatment program, which is your self-contained group. And many of these young people have experienced trauma in some shape, form, or fashion. And I've always found, especially with the young men, man, it's just building that relationship, you know. And a lot of times, a lot of things you don't even have to worry about bringing up, because they're going to bring it to you. You know, the more comfortable they feel. Again, just keeping in mind context. And like she said, I think that language was huge.
Yeah.
Kind of just listening for where they're coming from. You know, the more you know about them. And sometimes, especially again with these young men, just being not brutally honest, sorry to use that language, but you know, just talking about the reality.
Authentic.
A lot of
We'll say authentic.
Authentic. But, you know, a lot of times we don't talk about these issues, and so you know they've got to be brought up. And that's something just as a community we've got to get over that. And we definitely have to be able to look into that mirror and embrace, you know, what's going on, and then how do we overcome these challenges. So I think the better the relationship, you know, the easier that is to do. And again, the more authentic it is all the way around.
I love it. Thank you so much for that. And I'm going to challenge myself, because I want to say so much more that I'm not. Because we're going to get into that a little bit more here in a moment. And I will let you, was that you, Tamitra? Yeah, hold on one second. We're going to go a little deeper on that, but I love that point. What was your name? Was it James?
Yeah, James Carter.
James. Well, you throw me off because it says R. Troy Wilkins, so somehow I was able to catch that. Okay.
Yeah, this is actually my first day. I just started with Best Buy.
Okay, well, welcome. So glad to be with you.
Yes,
but you made a great point. It's all about relationship, and we're going to talk in a minute about relationship, how we go about building relationship, and how much timing matters. So I'm going to hold myself, because I have a whole thing on that in a minute. But Demetria, what were you going to say?
I just wanted to mention, like, kind of piggybacking, but one of the major things, like when I think about incarcerated parents, is by the time the trauma that the youth or the families have already been through, and building that foundation, but how, when it comes to certain things, how do you explain to your child, your youth, whatever the case may be, what exactly it is that you went away for? So say dad went away and he ends up on Mega's Law website. How do you explain that charge or that purpose behind his incarceration? Like, and then it just goes, you never really know how it's going to go, because it's not even just being judged for being in jail. It's also has that, oh, well, he went because he did something to whatever the case may be. So I feel as if it's not just incarcerated, but that, how do you explain that incarceration when they come home? I feel like that's a major thing.
Yeah, well, and again, when you think about all of these life experiences, this one included, we got the thing, and then we got the results that happen because of the thing, right? So, and how it impacts me right after it happens versus how that might show up 10 years later or 5 years later, like it's really evolving as to how it impacts us. So hopefully we aren't in our roles explaining to someone why their parent went away, because I don't know that that's our role or our right to do so. So that's one of those boundary things, which we are going to talk about as well. Somebody said instead of saying they're on vacation. Yeah. So yeah, I can't go into that as much as I want, but I do, that language is important. And I think we have to be thoughtful about where is our seat, what is our responsibility? Because the parent is definitely going to have to figure out how to explain that later. But I don't think it's our role to be running through those details or attempting, and I'm not saying you were, but it made me that you were saying that, but I think it's important to clarify that that's one of those boundary things. And again, we're going to talk about it more, of us understanding what is our role. Because sometimes we get so interested in being helpful that we start becoming unhelpful because we're trying to be helpful, right? So we're going to get into that more. I'm still holding back. You guys are challenging me, but I'm not going to go deeper than that right now. So I'm going to come back to that though. Anybody else? Gustavo, I see you off mute.
Yeah, I wanted to say something too about like the word incarceration, how it has really negative connotations, and because people will do illegal things and get in trouble. But I also want to say that in our community, I think these feelings in youth can happen with deportation, which might be more like an injustice that they're seeing it, as opposed to something negative as to why they're being quote unquote incarcerated or just being deported away from the country. So that's a real big fear.
Yeah.
Especially during the Trump administration, when ICE was coming into a lot of these Southern California cities, there was a lot of anxiety going around about that. So I just wanted to bring that up, that sometimes it might not be like something that negative that has happened or something illegal, and it seems more like an injustice to the youth, but that these feelings are still propagating in them. So
yeah, and that even further, like, so sometimes they're being incarcerated and it's really because of injustice or oppression. And then other times we have family, or we have a feeling that we're being done wrong, but we kind of like are wrong, like we really did actually do something bad. And then like, so you have a family who's like, they did him dirty and but he like actually did rob the bank, and you know what I mean? So like that's a whole thing too, of like, if we're showing up a certain way and the family showing up a certain way. But this is also again why boundaries are important, because if we're getting this deep into a conversation, it's a good chance we're off track, depending on how, and you guys are not going to get me to go into that because we're going into that later. So I'm staying true to the game. Astrid, is it Astrid?
Yes. Good morning, everyone. I'm Astrid. So I used to actually run a summer camp where I would take young people anywhere from like 11 to 18 to go visit their moms in federal prison. So a lot of these conversations, like these young people already were aware that their parents, obviously they were in prison, but they have very vivid memories of their parents being arrested and how they themselves as children were victimized by the police coming in. So when the police are actually coming in and arresting a parent, they're treating everyone inside of the household as someone who's broken the law, right? So you're talking about little kids, 8 years old in the middle of the night, probably, like just from conversations that, where young people were sharing their experiences. And so they already have all these memories, which is already like traumatic in itself.
Yeah.
And then having their parents leave, now you're having grandparents take on that parent role. And it's really difficult for grandparents to be able to take time out, because now they have to usually get other jobs to be able to provide, even though they're getting like, government assistance or whatever. But it's just in itself going into the prison system, because, and I'm not going to say everyone, but in my experience, I've noticed that all of the people that have worked in these institutions already believe that these people are bad because they're in there for a reason, and they're going to treat their young people exactly the same way. So it's really unfortunate. It's heartbreaking, because it's almost like these young people are expected to kind of follow in their parents' footsteps.
Yeah. And
like they are very, like they're just treated terribly. There's like all these systems that are put in place to like keep parents, and because of COVID, I know that now that's changed a bit. But when we were going up there, like we had to literally pass through like all these like it's just like, it's just crazy. Like you can't wear certain things. And if you are wearing it, there are organizations. Yes, there are organizations at some of the facilities that will have extra clothes or extra shoes if, let's say, you're not wearing the right kind of thing. But I had one experience where one of the officers told one of my young people, because they forgot to leave their cell phone inside of the inside of one of our vans. And this officer was like, oh yeah, I can arrest you because this is a crime. And although it is like, by the rules that they set in place, just kind of like someone telling a young person that who's there to see their parent, like, it's just, again, all these systems are set in place for a reason. Yep. So I just think that really kind of like having the incarcerated population already like face all of these things, and a lot of the times why they're in prison is because of systematic oppression. Like there's all these things in place, like they're in there for theft, they're in there for things that now people are making money off of. So it's unjust, it's frustrating, it's heartbreaking, but I'm really loving this conversation. So thank you all.
Thank you. And this is why we're here, right, you guys? This is why we're here. We know, unfortunately, because if any one of us could have changed the world fully by now, I know it was on my radar for a long time. I was going to change the world, but it hasn't worked out yet. But if we could have, right, disrupted all of this ridiculousness, we would have. So the next best thing is doing what we do, right? In showing up, being supportive. And again, this is why it's thoughtful that we understand what folks are going through, that we understand racism, that we understand systemic oppression, and we understand then how we show up properly so that we add value. And again, we're going to get into this in a minute, how we make sure we do that in a way where we don't go so hard on loving on the peeps that we don't ultimately start causing harm. I'm going to go really quickly because I think this is related into a little bit about trauma and treatment, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the problems on the treatment side, again, to this point, because some of this also sucks. So hold that part. I'm going to tell you a little about the treatment. Some of you may know this, maybe you don't. But I'm going to end this part by saying, and this system's broken too in some ways. And so we're going to just go full circle. So on trauma treatment, couple of things to know. Of course, there's different types of treatment. Individuals can get support. There's group and family treatment. There's also school and guidance counselors. And I bring this up because it's important, because if you're supporting a youth and they are getting help from school, it's not the kind of help they would get from therapy unless they have in-school therapists. So just know that school counselors and counselors, or school counselors and therapists, are not the same thing. School counselors really just focus on addressing the barriers to school success. They do brief stuff, and it's definitely not solution oriented as it relates to like healing and stuff like that. They don't do diagnosis, they make referrals. So just want to make sure, and that's important, because if we're supporting a youth and we think they have the support they need, they might not have it. So just knowing that difference is important. There's also support groups that could be available for them. The other important thing is that most of the time, folks don't get counseling or treatment right away. So what we see, and this is one of the sources for many of the world's problems. We're talking about gun reform. We're not going to go there, but I'm just saying, like, if folks were given an opportunity to get healing and get support for addressing their stuff, we don't get into some of this other stuff, right? So, and I can tell you, whether it's as a therapist or in the coaching I do, folks tend to not show up until the SHIT hits the fan, right? Unfortunately. And so we tend to have adults and youth in front of us included, who have long-standing trauma that hasn't been addressed before we ever go get help or get an opportunity to get help. So it's very rare, that like something happens and then you get counseling. It's just not usually the case. Of course, medication is an option. I'm going over this medication, not because I'm a medication promoter, because I'm not. If you ever came to me as a therapist, I'm never starting with meds unless you are just so beyond where I can support you right now that the only way we could get started is to get you meds. So I'm not a proponent of starting with meds, but I do know for sure that meds work. I've used meds at points in my life, and I've had many clients be successful with them. It's important to also know meds are not a solution. No one should be on meds without being supported by a professional. I say this because, well, we'll get into a minute to talk about some of the issues with meds. But one of the things we do see is that a lot of folks, especially folks in minority populations, are scared of meds. And so I do want you to at least know meds are a thing. Meds can be helpful, but sometimes we have to support folks if they really do need meds and understanding, or at least getting the information they need to consider how it could be helpful. And I won't go too much in depth there because, again, this is not what you all do for a living, but just wanted to share a little bit of information about how that works. Some of the challenges, and you guys probably know this, again, when we talk about broken systems, we got a lot of mis and overdiagnoses that go on out here. These are 5 common diagnoses, especially with youth. And if you look at the list, these all look, and some of them look super similar, right? And so misdiagnosis happens just because we're not sure. Misdiagnosis also happens because of some other things that I'm going to get into. But misdiagnosis is a thing. So we can be advocates, at least, that if something doesn't seem right, we can at least be asking questions. Hold on one second, Heather. I'm going to get this last piece and then I'll get your comments or questions. On the treatment challenges, again, not every child receives counseling or adult, and not every child or adult receives good counseling, right? And I'm a therapist, I love my peeps, but just because folks are in therapy doesn't mean they're getting good therapy, just keeping it real. Some other limitations, if you have youth who are in a foster home, there are certain permissions that are needed. So you can have some issues if the bio parent doesn't want to give permission, or, you know, they got to argue back and forth between the bio parent and the children's services people. Wait lists are an issue. They were an issue before. They're super an issue now with COVID. Obviously, stigma is an issue, and that is especially the case with minority populations, lack of access and insurance. Many of the approaches, and quite frankly, the field itself is Eurocentric as heck. So it's not culturally responsive in and of itself. And when we say evidence-based, what does that evidence mean? Like, if you studied this med or this approach on primarily white folks, is it evidence-based? I mean, it's evidence-based for that population, but we tend to want to just use the evidence-based word just everywhere. We just want to throw it, like, what is it, Oprah? Evidence-based for you, evidence-based for you, right? And so there's some issues there. And then, of course, the issue with acceptance in cultures. On the medication side, over-medication can be an issue. Some of the common issues that you can hear from folks about meds is, this makes me tired, this makes me feel sick, I'm gaining, losing weight, I feel dizzy, I don't feel like myself, they're not working. Sometimes folks, if you've been on meds for a while and then you just suddenly discontinue them, that is really not good. And it can make you feel really crazy for a really long time. So if you have folks on meds, you need to make sure that you just support them and never ever doing anything other than what's directed without talking to the person who prescribed it first, because there's some really serious stuff that can happen if folks just decide all of a sudden they're just not going to take the meds anymore. Another thing that I see that's just absolutely heartbreaking is there are a lot of pediatricians who diagnose kids early with like ADHD and stuff like that, and then put them on meds early as 4 and 5 years old. They never even see a behavioral health expert. And then the kids have been on meds from 4 or 5 years old all the way through like 13. So if you encounter them at 13 and they've been on meds their whole life, we don't even really know who this kid is, because this kid has never had a chance at life without being on meds. So I'm it's very concerning to me as a behavioral health expert to see how many pediatricians who are not behavioral health experts diagnosing and giving meds to youth without having them also being seen by a behavioral health expert. And I'm going to make a couple more comments, and I'm going to give it open the floor because I know y'all got something to say. But I want to tell you why I'm noting this. One, because we're in position to support youth and families to have accurate expectations We're not supposed to be experts, but it's helpful. The more you know about these systems and their brokenness, the better you can support folks themselves in having accurate expectations. The other issue is if you're not clear and you kind of assume, and you tell a parent or you tell a family or you tell a youth, oh yeah, you'll be going, once you go to court, you should get an answer next week. If you don't know that most of the time a court case takes a year to a year and a half or longer, then you accidentally have set them up with confusion and potentially re-traumatization because you're making assumptions and throwing out some suggestions that are not necessarily accurate. So it's really important that we know our stuff, and every system is different. Your city, even city to city within a state, is different. So really, as much as you can, knowing how it works in your neck of the woods is important. It's also important that you understand the limits and risks among the systems, processes, and people, because again, we as mentors or folks who are working with youth in whatever role can like assume like that if a person is connected with said program, that the program's good. And the youth is trying to tell you, hey, something's not right here. And you kind of just assume that because they're in the system or they're with a professional, that it's all good, and it might not be. So we do need to know that sometimes it's not good, or it's not a good fit, or the meds are a problem, so we can be supportive. And then lastly, it's important because we need to know when to refer and who to refer to. Some of the conversation I had with some of your team a couple of weeks ago, there were a couple of comments about referring to children's services and losing trust, or calling the police and losing trust. So I just wanted to take a moment to note, we should be calling children's services and the police only when we have to, because those two systems, almost for sure, there's going to be some trauma involved, even if they're doing everything the right way. And there's just some undue trauma that doesn't have to happen if that's not the right phone call. So we really need to make sure everyone who's on this call, every team that's on this call, has relationships. And I know Jennifer has some things to add on this, has relationships. Some of you have, I think, in-house mental health folks or whatever, but you got to have relationships with other folks in the field, in your community, as your starting points, because unless somebody is abused and you know it, or somebody is at risk for something serious, the police and children's services should not be your first call, because it's just not a good starting point. So Jennifer, I'll give you a moment, and I know y'all got stuff to say. I'll be quiet so you all can give me your thoughts. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. I think this last point is really important. And I just wanted to note that I think it's applicable to mentors too. I think sometimes mentors feel a sense of pressure that they need to resolve every situation, or they need to make things better, maybe have some kind of savior complex, when in reality, even really well-intentioned mentors, might not have the training or be equipped to handle these situations. And so having a list of referrals to mental health services is so important. I think some of the organizations on the call have in-house mental health services, but if you don't, I think it's a great idea to create a list of local resources and services that you can refer out to.
Thanks, Jennifer. And I'll be quiet and give you guys an opportunity to respond. Any thoughts on these? We're going to be wrapping up this section, moving on into the application of all of this stuff next. So just anybody, I know Tamara, you mentioned, you guys are confirming in the chat, like, as I've already said, it's really heavy out here. There's not a lot of help available because the wait lists are so heavy. And again, folks are burnt out. So even when they do get to help, whether or not it's someone who's in the best shape to help them is questionable. So again, that's just us being there and being supportive is important. Anybody want to add anything or have a question? Heather, I know you came off mute. Let me just check back with you real quick.
Hi, thank you. Just adjusting my headphones. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. Anybody else, questions or thoughts?
I wanted to jump in, yeah. So I had a couple of things, just thinking about podiatry. doctors and
yes,
like that field as a whole. I have two questions also. Let me start by that first. But I wanted to say, my understanding was that I thought they were like switching up the screening process so that they were doing more kind of cross field conversations. And even like, I thought the questions for mental health screening was more extensive now.
In theory, yes. I mean, is the field making progress? Yeah. How fast is it? You tell me how fast our system is, right? Like we all know that there's some stuff we've been talking about doing better for a long time. So how that's actually playing out, I don't know right now. I also know that so we can do an ADHD screening right now and just do the questionnaire. And then I could confirm, it doesn't take a licensed person to see you answered enough yeses, so it's ADHD. That is not the same as then providing the ongoing support, because they can they validate that there's ADHD present? Sure. But are they also then connecting them with someone who can look at supportive services and strategies that help me not just take meds, but learn how to add structure in my life so that I can manage my ADHD. Maybe I don't even need meds. Maybe my ADHD is such that if I use these things, I would be able to manage it without meds. So I don't know that I would love for us to get to a time where all of that thoughtfulness is being done. But when you also look at how overloaded our system is, everybody's just doing the best they can to crank people through. So that makes it even worse. So in theory, yeah, is it getting better? It doesn't change my point that we have an opportunity to advocate and keep an eye out. Because a lot of our people, our youth and families will not push back on a doctor, will not ask questions, will just go with whatever's told, will take whatever we're supposed to be taking, have no idea if that's a large dose or a small dose. Is this a start? So not that we need to know that, because that's not my point. My point is for us to just be aware that this is an opportunity for advocacy, to support in question asking, and support in going to find the peeps who do have the answers and do have the expertise to just double check. So love your optimism, and yes, in theory, but I don't know how much that's playing out. And what was your other thought or question?
Okay, I have one comment and then one question. So my comment was kind of to, I think not Heather. Somebody had said this before, but just in terms of you don't got the answers, Sway, it's okay, and I think it's our ego gets the best of us. Even when I think we're, as a youth worker, I think I have a pretty understanding mind, and I'm not trying to always have the answers. And I think one phrase that I use a lot is, I don't know right now, but I could get you the answer. Because then that way it's it doesn't burst your ego too, you get to have the answers, but they just aren't there. Right now. Yeah, exactly. So
I love
think
that.
That's useful.
I love that. Thank you. Good suggestion.
Yes. And then this is maybe unrelated to work as a whole, but I have a friend who's currently pregnant who has mental health. She's taking medications, and she's stopped taking meds in her last trimester. And all of us are kind of pushing her, don't do that, because we're nervous for her well-being, but she's nervous for the child's well-being. And so I'm wondering what is the long-term effects on a child whose parent was taking meds while pregnant?
I don't know that answer because that ain't my area of expertise. I'm not gonna have it tomorrow either, girl, because that ain't my lane. But but my suggestion is always tell people to talk to the expert. Because if a doctor, ask the doctor, or ask more than one doctor, right? If for all of any question, ask the doctor, ask more than one doctor. There are certain meds that should not be taken while you're pregnant, especially in late med. So I don't know what the meds are, but it's going to always be ask your doctor. We should never be making medicine moves without the doctor, because we don't know. And I'm gonna be honest, I took myself off meds once. It was traumatic. It was not good. I was very sick. Don't do it. I'm just telling you, because I literally know that this is not a good idea. So I don't know that answer, but I do know that we know who knows, right? So the answer is go to the person who knows.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hallelujah. This is I just want to respond. I think that is relevant, your question about your friend, because we have teen parents here too. And, those are questions that might come I mean, I haven't had any teen parent telling me about their mental health and medication with that, but I know we have teen parents seeking for like help and services during their pregnancy as well. So it is very relatable to our work.
Yeah, and again, this is why we should never be acting like we know that answer or that we're even going to check on that answer. We're going to tell them that they need to go to their peeps. Even as a clinician, I am not licensed to discuss or prescribe meds. So as much as I do know, my answer is you need to talk to your doctor, right? That should be your answer. All your job is to do is to validate their concern and encourage them to get accurate answers, support them in getting accurate answers from the person who would have the accurate answer. Got it? All right.
I have a question.
Yes.
So culturally, coming from a South American country, I know that we are like medication and therapists and psychologists are not our first like go-to. For our parents is always, you don't have anything, whatever. Yeah, right. For us, like personally, we had the psychologist and the therapist at school, like a counselor, but it was never like, oh, let me figure out what you have. No, nothing like that. So when the teacher was saying that maybe you were a little like weird or whatever, they get, okay, what do you have? What are you thinking? Like, that was it. So I know most of our Latino communities here, at least, are very like proud, and they never want to kind of provide more information, and they will never want their kid like going and telling all the story and all what they are feeling in front of a bunch of people. So kind of more than a resource to find a therapist or a counselor or whatever, is finding that information for another cultures to get more familiar with the benefits of having a therapist or a counselor talking to your kid about whatever they are feeling. Because I think personally and in my experience, like, it's not a thing. And if you come to a Latino community, a Latino family, and say, hey, and maybe your kid needs some help with a therapist, they will be like, okay, wait, like, I don't want that. I don't want our family issues just coming out for fun. So one of the big situations will be trying to find those resources in different languages and those resources that can kind of teach the families and guide the families through the whole process, kind of starting from scratch. Like, how do you get families comfortable?
Well, Maria, this is a good point, and you guys keep pulling. I feel like I should just skip ahead to this other part. And by the way, we're so behind, but I love it because we're talking and it's good stuff and we're learning. Let me see what we're working with here. Hold on one second. I'm trying to strategize. Okay, we can at least make it through that. All right, I'm not going to skip ahead because we'll at least make it through this really important part that I want to cover. I'm just going to say this for now, and then we're going to pin it because I'm going to come back to it. Maria, remind me. The boundary. I keep coming up with this boundary thing. We got to know our limitations, guys, and we got to do everything we can and then know when we've done all we can. It's a horrible answer, but it's the reality, right? So quick answer for now on that is, again, what I already said. You guys have to do your best to always stay in relationship with the local peeps who are your go-tos, both generally and culturally, because to your point, referring folks of certain cultures to just any old counselor is not a good look. And you do risk losing their trust because you just threw them to whoever. So as much as you can, finding not only who you're going to connect them to, but finding folks who are culturally responsive and who can relate is critical. And you should be doing that. You should have those relationships already before the moment when you need to connect someone. And that should just be ongoing effort that you guys make to be in relationship with folks in the community who are your go-tos. Even like, so you can get that bat phone number, like, hey girl, I know y'all normally do this, but I really need to talk to you about so-and-so. You know what I mean? Just to do that relational thing, because sometimes that's what folks need. We're gonna get, again, into that more, but I think one of the hardest parts about our work is that we cannot solution everything we want to. Even as a therapist, which I'm deeper, if I'm in a therapy role, I'm in deeper than you guys, I can't solution everything I want to. So we're gonna talk about that more in a second, but yeah, and to your point, again, and to your point of later in adulthood, sometimes it just means it might not happen right now. It's not our job. Like, we're going to try to inspire folks, but we got to honor that people are where they are. And if folks don't opt into solutions that we would love for them to right now, then that is their choice. And we have to respect that. Even when we think it would be so helpful, it is not helpful to have somebody beating your ears up about how helpful a thing would be that you're not open to right now. Right? So sometimes we have to know that it would be really awesome if you would consider trying this thing. But if you've done your part, you got to know when to lean back on that, because you start becoming unhelpful when you are being overly helpful, if that makes sense. You guys with me? All right, so it's 3:32. In my mind, we was going to do a little break. Are y'all good? Because we only got 28 minutes left and I didn't even get to the juiciest parts yet. So if y'all got to go pee, do your thing. Again, we're recording. We're not going to do an official pause. And we're going to get into the application, which the cool part is we've really been talking about application the whole time. So maybe we're not as behind as I feel we are, right? So obviously we know when it comes down to empathy in youth work or human services work of any kind, empathy is required, right? So I think you guys are, if y'all don't know nothing, y'all know empathy. And I noticed that when we were on our call a couple of weeks ago. I love the amount of empathy you guys all show up to this work with. So in the research and sort of how I pull all of this together, there's really 3 keys to effective mentoring, right? Because we know mentoring increases protective factors and decreases risk factors. So it's being developmental rather than prescriptive. It's being trauma-informed and culturally sensitive. And it's always noting where we are on the relationship journey. And when we do, we know, because if we begin with the end in mind, the goal is to develop healthy youth, right, with strong developmental assets. Well, you can't do that unless you have culturally responsive, trauma-informed, good relationship, and be developmental, right? So that's like the keys to the game. We always know that. So the be developmental part, you guys, I'm sure you've been doing a mentoring a long time, so you know this. Like, developmental means I'm helping you grow. Prescriptive means I'm telling you the answers, right? I'm doing the tests for you in super summary, right? We don't want to be prescriptive. We want to be developmental with our families and our youth. So that means we're asking questions. We're giving information for them to look through, but we're not giving answers. We're giving them the opportunity to develop and grow. We are not saving anyone. As helpful as we might think it is, it actually is not, right? So, because if I always give you answers, then you need me. So as soon as I'm not here, you don't have the skill set you need to go forth and be great. So we always have to challenge ourselves to be developmental rather than prescriptive. Makes sense? Simple enough, right? Well, in theory, simple enough, right? So you guys know about the developmental assets, right? And risk and protective factors. Like, this is what it's all about. Or you guys hit me in the chat, just confirm you're familiar with these concepts, because I'm not going over there in depth. I hope you know about social and emotional learning. I hope you know about risk and protective factors. I hope you know about the 40 developmental assets. Get in the chat, let me know. Or come on and just say, yeah, we got it. We know this. We're experts. Where are you at? It's quiet. What happened?
Okay, I don't know this that well. I feel like I recognize some of it.
Okay.
And I think they generally make sense to me, but I was going to be one of the people who said no.
Okay. Well, the great thing is this stuff's all over the internet. Google developmental, 40 developmental assets, Google risk and protective factors, and Google social emotional learning. There's super dope stuff on there. It's easier, like, to go try to Google trauma. There's so much to it. That's a little bit harder to do. These are really simple concepts and stuff that you guys can just have at your fingertips. This is ultimately, you need to know this because your mentors need to know this, right? Protective factors are the things that support us in going forth and being great. Risk factors are the things that cause us to may not be able to go forth and be great. Mentoring and great relationships are increased protective factors, right? And so don't Google now because you're supposed to be listening to me, okay? Don't do ADHD on me, okay? Just note it for later. But ultimately, this is the work we're doing, right? Is to develop all of this stuff. So whenever you're working with your mentors or when you yourself are working, everything you do is about helping folks get here in a developmental way, which means I'm helping you learn it for yourself, not giving you the answers. Make sense? And maybe we can do another training later, Jennifer, on that. But this stuff is, I mean, if you guys at least familiarize yourself with it, it's not complex. It's just, it will help. Like if you have this list, you could be thinking, oh, that's something we could really be focused on, honing in on a value that we could help a youth learn, or an empowerment component we could really hone in on with a family. So it just is a nice, helpful list of things to just keep handy. Now, in the center of your screen, I have boundaries and expectations circled, and I have alluded to this multiple times. This is going to be the medicine part of the presentation. And I say medicine because I'm about to give y'all some tough love, and I've kind of already given it to you, so we kind of eased you in. You guys have to know your role. You are not a therapist, we know that. I know that the National Mentoring Partnership uses the word friend generally. We're not BFFs, okay? We're caring mentors and caring adults. It's very important that you know this, because even the word friend, if you think about the word friend, some of us, when we say friend, we kind of use that word real casually, because like Facebook, you're friends with like 1,000 people. You've never even met them, right? So is that the kind of friend we're talking about? Or are we talking about like the friend that you do anything and everything for? So this word friend is kind of problematic, but we're not friends. We might have some things in our relationship with these folks who feel friendshipy, but we got to know what we are and we aren't, right? So boundaries are critical in this work, because when I thought about a lot of the comments and questions that came up in our pre-call, and then I think back to all of the work that I've done, all of the training that I do, not just with people who do this work, but with people in life. One of the hardest things that people struggle with is boundaries. And when you don't have good boundaries, not good things happen. Everything in life needs a bound, right? That's why we have rules and laws. Like, if you could just go whatever speed you want, we'd be wilding out here. I'd be driving fast. I don't know about y'all, but I would be driving fast. So, right? So we have these parameters because every good thing is good in measure, right? There's really not a thing, well, money might, I don't know. Anyway, most things need limitations, right? I will take as much money as y'all want to give me, but other than that, everything needs limitations. So we need to have boundaries because it guides how you show up to the relationship. It prevents and minimizes transference and countertransference, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And it helps you manage emotional investment. And this is where it gets all sticky, because we get all super emotionally invested and we start forgetting what this is and isn't. And then we think we're responsible for having answers that we're not responsible for having. We think we're responsible for outcomes we're not responsible for. We think a lot of stuff, and then it gets funky. And then you don't know that it's a problem until it's a problem, right? So just a couple of things to note. We shouldn't be seeking information about personal experiences or trauma in order to build relationships. So hopefully we all know that, but just going on record. So we shouldn't be asking and trying to get deep so we can really be close. We're asking general questions to get to know people in general, but we shouldn't be going for the really heavy, deep stuff. We should not. That's a problem, and it will show up later. It's not going to feel like a problem then. It's going to come up later. That's the problem. That's why this is hard, because when there's a boundary issue, it's not when it first started, it's later, and then it's too late to redirect. And you should always be noting to yourself and to them where the boundaries are, and that includes mandated reporting. So it shouldn't be news. Even for me as a clinician, if I sense you about to tell me, hey, listen, just want to make sure you know, we talk about this all the time. If you tell me this and this is what I got to do. I stop them before they tell me, because I want to make sure we're clear here on what it is, right? So if I see that you're getting really close to me, oh, I want you to come to my thing and I want you to, you know what, I really appreciate you inviting me, but I just want to remind you, you know, unfortunately, you know, if we were in a different world and different time, my answer might be different, but there's just certain things I can and can't do. I know it's tough, but you know, so these are things that have to always be part of your relationship and part of your conversation. Because if it isn't, then, because you guys ask a lot of questions, but how do I avoid breaking trust? How do I avoid? Well, you avoid it by never getting there in the first place as much as possible, right? So when you have boundaries, we reduce concerns about losing trust and betrayal. We reduce concerns about dealing with strong reactions to trauma, because if I am in the proper relationship with you within my bounds and I'm not a therapist, there's less likelihood that a person is going to like tell like certain things if I'm showing up right. Again, I know this is generally speaking, because it just depends. Any kid could tell you anything anytime, but it does have a lot to do with how you showed up to them up until that moment, right? So it minimizes that because this was another concern, that they would think you don't care. It minimizes whether you think you're qualified to do the work. It minimizes you struggling to close a relationship. Because if you were handled this all along, right, the right way with boundaries, it's not going to be as hard. It's always hard when you have a good relationship with someone and you're wrapping it up. But if we were clear all along what this was, it's not going to be that hard because we always knew this was coming. Now, if you only said that at the beginning, and then now it's been 9 months and 2 years, and we just now talking about enclosure, yeah, it's going to be hard. So we missed it in the relationship along the way, right? It also minimizes vicarious trauma in secondary trauma, because when you don't have boundaries, you get so enmeshed in people's stuff that it's super heavy, you're carrying it, it's funky, and now you're stressed and you're burned out, and now you're thinking about them, your husband's over there, you never even talk to him anymore because you're always thinking about the kid and, you know, all that stuff, right? So quick note on the transference and countertransference, because this is the thing in therapy too. This is a quote: "It can be the best of servants and the most awful of masters." So this is an image of a sort of a therapy session, but this is the case in mentoring or any other relationship. So you got the person on the left, background, abandoned by my father, I got ADHD, I was physically abused, I used marijuana, my parents were divorced. On the right, this person, and this is supposed to be the professional, my husband's cheating on me, I go to happy hour regularly, I got high anxiety, I was sexually abused as a child, and I have low self-worth. So when you see these two people come together, right, and we got all this stuff because everybody got their own lives they're coming to the relationship with, you see how lit it can get really fast. So the cool thing about countertransference, which all this is that relational exchange, right, is that when me and Fran know we got something in common, you know, that makes the relationship easier, because like now I could say, hey girl, you know, because we got that thing, right? So that's the part where it says it can be the best of servants, because that's how you build rapport and you get people to talk, and you know what I mean? You get all these great outcomes. Now, the awful master part is when me and Fran get so cool that this ain't exactly, there's no boundaries. So me and Fran hanging out, I'm thinking about Fran all the time. I want to buy her gifts. She buys me. You see what I'm saying? So now the fact that we knew we had this thing in common becomes this really messy thing, right? And it's too late then. So that's why you struggle with a closure, or that's why you feel like they're going to think that you violated their trust because you went way too deep. And then you got to this moment where you're like, oh, I shouldn't be this deep. Well, yeah, it's going to be hard to pull out now because you went so deep, deeper than you ever should have gone. I'm a therapist and I'm not supposed to go this deep. So if you're not a therapist, you definitely are not supposed to go this deep. So you guys have to know this as the folks who help mentors and sometimes work with youth directly. And you got to know this so that you make sure your mentors understand this. The boundaries are everything. And I'm telling you, when I was in school, they would tell me about boundaries and I'll be like, whatever, you don't understand relationships. So then, you know what I mean? I was doing my own thing. I've tested this. So, and y'all know this. Once you get too deep, next thing they know, you know they're asking you for money. And you're like, damn, how do we get here? Well, if I sat there and I was able to observe your relationship for the last 6 months, I could tell you exactly how they got to the point where they thought they could ask you for money, because that was something you facilitated in how you engaged. And then now you got there and now you like, I don't want to hurt their feelings and tell them no. But some of that is because of how you showed up. So this is the hard part, because in our minds, we want to show up and do everything we can for people. That is not your job to do every single thing that you're humanly capable of doing for every youth you work with or any youth you work with. Newsflash, this might sound harsh, but this is real. Even as a therapist, it is not my job to give every ounce of my being to every client, to any client. It's my job to be supportive. It's my job to provide direction when I can, right? It's my job to provide information. I'm not that other stuff. So I'm gonna pause for a minute. Jennifer, I know you have a couple of things you wanna add, and I know y'all got something to say, but this right here, it don't feel right, but I've tested it both ways. I've done it boundaryless and I've done it with boundaries, without question. And let me let y'all know, I love on the peeps like no other. Like I love on the peeps, but I'm telling you for sure, the better way for you and them is with boundaries. So Jennifer, I know you had some thoughts that you wanted to add, and then we're gonna let the people speak.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. So in the conversation about boundaries, the impacts group has been talking about mentoring and serving youth impacted by addiction and youth with an incarcerated parent. And one topic that comes up is, developing that relationship and then closing it safely and effectively, because youth are, the goal is for these relationships to develop and flourish. And if that happens successfully, then when the mentor leaves, it can leave a gap. And so we want to make sure that those closures are really happening successfully. One step I recommend all mentoring programs and clubhouses take is to examine your mentor agreement and make sure that you have a defined commitment length in that agreement, whether that's 6 months, a year, what have you. That can really help make sure that you as the program staff, the mentor, and the youth are all on the same page around how long the mentor will be in the young person's life and how they can successfully transition in and out of your program. So we have some resources on Clubhouse Connect, some template resources that you can draw from, but it does kind of help facilitate successful boundaries and expectations and closure.
Thanks, Jennifer. All right, you guys, I know somebody got something. There he is, he's in the chat now. Okay, do you think it's important that youth understand it's temporary? It is critical. It's not important, it is not an option. The youth must know that it's temporary. It's bamboozlement otherwise, right? Like any other time, if you haven't told someone from the beginning, there's no way to avoid that being harmful, other than to make it clear in the beginning. So it's not just important, it is not an option. It should always be clear that the relationship is temporary in the beginning. Never, ever is it an option.
Can I add to that, Elizabeth?
Yes.
Yeah, and Elizabeth and I were talking earlier about that expectation setting, and I mentioned to her, like, I feel like one place I can really develop more resources in the future is around member onboarding to mentoring relationships. When they come into this space, I think it's a great idea to have a conversation with new youth about what the mentoring experience can look like, how they can expect mentors to come into the space and leave the space, what mentors are there for, and just kind of, give them some context for what this mentoring program might look like, so they are emotionally prepared when mentors do leave the space down the road.
Yeah. Yep.
Yes. If I could jump in really quick, I love that. And I think I asked the question. My name is Taya from the Best Buy Teen Tech Center. But I asked that question because I do mentor trainings with the mentors as they come in. And I address this. I address the closure, that part, because I didn't see it being, it just felt like they just went away. And I emphasize to them how important it is to, reinforce what was learned in this shared moment, in this shared experience, and kind of, make sure that it's emphasized that it's closing, but in a nice way. Like I said, by looking at what they've learned together, what they've done, how far they've come, and all these factors. But I don't think that from the youth side, that's there. So for me, this makes me say, hey, you know what? We need to kind of give them a training as well that discusses these things so that they know what to expect and not to expect as well, just like kind of what you were saying, Jen, too. And so I appreciate this conversation in so many ways. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. And thank you for making sure that that's covered in the training. Tamara, are you asking about this, how this then relates if you're a permanent staff? Yeah. So,
yes.
So here's the thing. While you don't have a specific deadline or end date as a staff member with youth, you do know that at some point, because they graduated, because you left the job, because of whatever reason, there will be a time when you two aren't together anymore. So you do know that, right? You also know that in your role, there are limitations even within the relationship while you're still engaged, right? So the boundary part is not just about, hey, let's be clear, I'm only going to be around for a set amount of time. It's also, what does it look like while I am around? So you know that I care about you, and you know I'm here to support you. But there's limitations to that, and making that clear in the beginning. I'll never be able to do everything I want to do for you, right? Because I think you're awesome, you know, and you deserve the world. There are limitations that I have. I'll always, so that you can communicate that, even though you guys don't have end dates, right? You can and should be communicating that in the beginning, because this is the thing. On the other hand, we're trying really hard to build relationship and connection, right? So if we do that without the bookend, right, then it's relationship without bound, right? So we should always be clear about what it is and isn't. A therapist said, we don't know the end date, but we do know there's going to be one. I let people know my job, if I'm a therapist, my job, if I do my job well, then that means we should not be talking anymore, because you got it, girl. So you should be getting to a point when you don't need me anymore. So I say that in the beginning, but then as we move along, I make little comments to make sure that they know, hey girl, this is a goal. You're doing great with this. You're getting closer to being able to do this on your own. Girl, one day you ain't gonna need me. Sometimes it's just casual. It's not necessarily, we're not gonna be able to talk after month 6. It's the casual way of just making sure folks know gently, right, that there are limits, as in the beginning and the end, and limits as to what this is going to look like. So it's, girl, I would have came to your game if I could. My boss I would be in so much trouble. Sometimes I just do it like that. You know what I mean? So that they just, and you got to sprinkle them throughout, because if you only do that at the beginning, and then y'all have known them for 10 years, or your mentor's known them for 6 months, and then they just do it 6 months later, there's no way to do that without people being hurt. So that's why it's important that it's all the way throughout. Tamara, does that answer where you were going with that question?
It does. It helps. Thank you.
Yes. And you guys, this is hard. It feels funky, but the better you do it all along, the less funky it is in real life. The less you're going to be worried about those feelings of mistrust and violation and betrayal and all of that. And the less you're going to be up at night thinking about somebody where there should be a boundary, right? Alexis, I also think we should slide into a conversation about the transition from youth in our program to alumni. The boundaries shift at those times. So that sounds like some good feedback for you, Jennifer, about how you guys operate with that. Youth as they transition into alumni status. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yep. I'm going to take a note of that, copy and paste.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and hi, I'm Alexis. I'm on Tamara's team actually. And I think a lot of the times when youth become older and they transition either after a career program or they're now considered an alumni member, a lot of the times they perceive a shift in boundaries. And I think it's cool to have like a conversation around how we manage those expectations of our kids.
Good feedback. Galen, you asked about examples of indications that a boundary is being jeopardized. They confine it. That's a hard one. If you want to give me an example, but I will just reiterate this. You're not going to know that you're in trouble until you're in trouble. That's the hard part. That's why I'm really stressing If you feel like y'all are BFs, that's my indicator, right? Like, if you're working towards becoming BFs, if you're working so hard on getting close that you're working super hard on being close, you missed it. So that's where it's like, what is my job? How close am I supposed to get? That's something that happens over I think it's almost like a muscle that you develop over time, right? It's a skill for you that is outside of each relationship. It's your skill of knowing, and it's different for each person, right? Because if you have somebody who's really hard to engage, then you're going hard at the beginning because like they barely talk or they're really like closed off, right? But if you day one meet a youth who's like spilling the beans, you need to lean way back, because clearly you're not going to have to go hard, and we need to send a message that, whoa, thank you, but no, right? So it's going to depend on who they are, and in order to really know that. So the indicator really is you paying attention. How close am I? How close am I trying to get all along? Because again, if we're looking for an indicator, the real indicator is going to be if you found out that you went too far. And it's so hard, because now if I see you as my BF, Galen, am I saying your name right, Galen?
Yeah, that's right.
Good. It's going to be really hard and that's when you feel horrible and you don't want to betray them. So then what you do is you don't set the boundary then either, because now you don't want to hurt their feelings. So now we go even deeper into the boundaryless relationship, right? No one's ever done this, right? And then now, so damn, when closure comes, we're screwed, right? Because we didn't want to hurt their feelings then, and we didn't want to hurt them then. And now we're so freaking deep, or they're doing so horribly because they're going through so much. You're sick because their trauma is now your trauma. You can't sleep and you're burnt out and you can't think about anyone else and blah, blah, blah. And then what do we do? What do I do for you in that moment? The only thing I can do is try to help you get out of it, but there's no simple answer to that because you're so deep. So does that help with your question?
Absolutely. Yeah. And, it's kind of building off Tamara's question too. It's just, kids really do confide in us, and we know them for an extended period of time. There's not necessarily like a deadline as to how much time we know this person.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes they just start opening up over time. And we find ourselves in a situation where we're not clinicians, we're not therapists, but these kids are just opening up to us. So, I guess my question is like, how do you know when it's time to like make that call, get that professional involved? How do you know when it's...
Thank you for asking that. So all along, as soon as you know that somebody's dealing with stuff that therapy would be helpful for, right away, I appreciate you shared that with me. Those are the kind of things that therapists and counselors can really help with immediately. Because if you continue just to allow them to tell you and tell you and tell you, and we're 6 months into them telling you all their stuff, you have become a therapist. So you've got to at some point say, you know what, those are the kind of things that you really need to, and then maybe if they have fears about, we talked about the cultural limitations about what that means. You help them understand what therapy is. They may not say yes right away, but you continue to give them information about what it looks like. You educate them on the difference between what you do and what a therapist does. So it has to happen right away. So if they're telling you their deepest, darkest secrets, congratulations. That means you're a great relationship builder. But you better watch, because if you're loving on them too hard, once they start doing that, and there's no indication that once I told you the thing, that there's some line here, and you might not draw it exactly, but that, you appreciate that I'm sharing this, but that's actually goes over there, then I'm gonna just keep going, because now I think that this is what this is. So it's an appreciation for the trust, and it's, man, you know what? Those are the kind of things that are really helpful, and people can really get support on. I appreciate you sharing this. What we do here is really this part. And over there, and then they might not go tell because they think they're going to lose their relationship with you if they go do that. So you want to also confirm to them they could do both. So they can have your thing and y'all do y'all's thing and y'all help them the way you do. And then they can do that thing with their clinician, right? So if they might have a fear that they would lose you, so you want to let them know that, hey, we can, this can all work, but we don't really do that kind of stuff here. But you deserve to have that heard and have an opportunity to not only be, because all I could do is hear you, but this person could help you do something with that. So you almost kind of put yourself like you're not as good as what somebody else would be and that they deserve something more. So that's kind of a strategy I would use. Does that help?
Yeah, very much. Like just what you just said just makes me feel more equipped, for those situations, and I appreciate it.
Great.
I have one tiny more consideration in this because this is all super helpful.
And
I feel like this
real quick, it's 4:01. If any of you have to go, we're going to keep recording. It's a bunch I didn't cover. Jennifer and I are going to figure out how I get to you guys the other stuff. So if you do have to go, we understand, but I don't want to cut you off, but I just want to let folks know, but we're going to record no matter what. So for those of you who have to drop. So Jennifer.
Yeah, and I think maybe we should keep a limit too. So maybe Elizabeth, if you're open to it. I know Alexis had her hand up, and then Tamara, and then I think we should wrap up. Are you open to that flow?
Sure. Okay. Sure. Go ahead. Is it Tamara?
Yes, thank you. I guess the only other thing I'd add here, because I feel that sometimes our team is brought to that place, like, let's go to the next level. Let's talk to somebody whose job this is, who can help you, who can go deeper. But we are in a bottleneck of mental health support here. So I have this fear that there would be no follow-up, or like where to send them that you're certain for sure. Like part of me was, I thought recently about a young man in our program. Part of me wants to find like a webinar about like, coping with anxiety, and we could sit and watch it together or something. And in a way, it's kind of passing a boundary, right? Because I'm certainly not an expert in anxiety, but so many of the experts, as Alexis put earlier, in our community, they have a wait list of 100 kids. So what would you recommend doing while these kids are in this limbo space?
I got you. So first of all, I appreciate you being worried, but also be worried about what happens when you go too far and too deep, because that is something we're not worried about and we need to be worried about. So let's balance our worry, because there's worries on both ends. So that's one. Two, you're not a clinician, but y'all can help folks know y'all can go through breathing exercises with folks. Y'all can go over using music to make yourself feel better when you're feeling some kind of way. Like, that's not therapy. So that is one of the things I had on my very last slide, which y'all aren't going to see because we're over time. But there's nothing like those are things you guys can do. So you can connect them to drumming circles. You can connect them to dance classes. You can explain to them how when you're feeling some kind of way, listening to music or getting out in nature or finding a hobby you love can be helpful. You can teach them that. So it's not like we're saying there's nothing we can do because there's no counselors. You guys can definitely support folks in knowing what are, and that's again, there's nothing, that's not therapeutic off limits kind of thing. So that's the answer is y'all can do that. We're not going to go in deep about what your mama did to you, but we can talk about how music can really help you when you're feeling some kind of way. You can do that all day long. Does that help? All right, who else? Was it Jennifer you said that had?
Yeah, I think Alexis had her hand up, and then when I can wrap it up.
Hi there. Kind of just bouncing off of Galen and Tamara. Oftentimes, we do kind of keep that professional relationship with a lot of kids, but they'll just come in and just, like you said earlier, spill the beans kind of out of nowhere. So I was wondering if you had any good redirection tips or good appropriate responses to come back at youth that come and just say something that's really, really personal and really just you feel like it's information you should not be hearing.
Mm-hmm. My quick answer, and I think I already said this, and maybe Jennifer, remind me, maybe I can come up. What would be cool is if you guys could give me like scenarios, send those to Jennifer. Maybe I can come up with a little thing of what I would say back. But again, number one, I'm going to acknowledge what was said. Wow, I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you for trusting me. That's really, I really admire that you are in touch with your reality enough that that's even something that's on your radar, right? So definitely affirmations and thank yous. And from there, it's, I want to make, something like, that's something that we might want to explore, options for you to be able to kind of like work through that. It's not something that I do, unfortunately, but I'm open to, if you want, because you want to always there to be their choice, we could look at some ways in which you could have an opportunity to talk about that more. So it's sort of it's a redirect. It's kind of a soft redirect, like not, oh, can't talk about that, but it's, I really appreciate you sharing. Those are the kind of things that really are a good fit for this, or for this kind of work, or that. And that's not really what we do, but here is an option, right? So that's my super quick summary of a potential way to do that. And Jennifer, maybe we can talk about some ways in which I could put something else together, but it's going to totally, it depends, but that's going to be my answer. Appreciation, acknowledgement, praise them for the fact that they're even acknowledging for themselves. And then that's not what I do, but that's going to be my answer really for most scenarios. So hopefully that at least gives you a direction to go in with that.
That's great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and Elizabeth, thank you for staying on extra. I know this was a heavy topic, but these 2 hours flew right by.
They did. I thought I had it, and y'all just came through, and I was like, "Ooh, we on time," and I was like, "Ooh, we late."
I know. Well, Elizabeth and I were saying before this call that we never know what kind of participation we'll get in virtual settings, and yeah, to everyone who showed up today, you really brought such energy and passion, and your dedication to serving your youth is very apparent. So we appreciate the way you showed up to this conversation and contributed to kind of our collective knowledge on this topic. As Elizabeth mentioned before about a different topic, you can't cover it in 1 slide or 10 slides, and that's definitely applicable to this training too. However, I do think there's a clear need for us to dig deeper into this, and we have some more resources, some mentor trainings that are kind of on the horizon, but I think it's worth us digging into this more too, and figuring out ways we can better support the network with this trauma-informed care training. So big thank you to everyone for joining, and huge thank you, Elizabeth, for partnering in this work. There's really no one else who was on my wish list to develop this training. You're at the top of it, and you made this content so approachable and informative, and down to earth too. So really appreciate your work on this.
Thank you. And y'all don't forget, for those who are part of that group, I'll be hanging out with you guys soon to be able to answer some questions as well. I'm sure you're about to go over that, Jennifer.
Yep, next Tuesday for the impacts folks. Yeah, I sent them an email today, so we're good. We're good on that.
All right, you guys, thank you so much for the energy. I'm sorry we didn't get to cover everything, but I feel like it's not like we lost time doing something unproductive or unhelpful. So thank you for the work you do. Please take care of yourselves, okay? Like self-care in real life, not as a hashtag on a shirt, but like in real life, like you guys have to take care of yourselves. And this boundary conversation we just had is critical, right? That's like, there's no self-care if you don't have this part. So please just take some time meditating on that topic. And again, thank you for trusting me. Thank you for the opportunity.